A grand manor wrapped in candlelight, where music once masked the whispers of a buried past. But even the most beautiful notes cannot drown out the sound of guilt. In the quiet between each movement, a secret waited, patient, poisonous, and perfectly composed. Tonight, the silence will speak louder than song. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is. Let me know in the comments. Let's step into the shadows of the past together. It arrived on a grey Tuesday morning, the sort of morning that seemed to hang in the air with a particular English indecision, neither wet nor dry. I had just returned from my walk along the embankment, chilled and with little hope of adventure, when I found Poirot seated by the fire, a single envelope resting on his lap, like a gift too delicate to unwrap. "Ah, Hastings," he said, without looking up, "our little grey cells are about to be stirred once more by music." The envelope was of heavy ivory stock, the sort reserved for royal summons or marriages of consequence. The crest stamped in gold at its center was one I vaguely recognized from the society columns, a family once influential, now spoken of in tones that combined reverence with nostalgia. Poirot held it delicately by its edges, like one might handle a rare manuscript. "It is from Lady Eleanor Talbot," he said. "You remember her, non?" I shook my head. He continued, unfolding the letter with surgical precision. "She invites us to Greystone Manor for a weekend of chamber music and what she calls a matter of private refinement." That last phrase intrigues me, Hastings. It has the scent of ambiguity, and where there is ambiguity, there is often mischief. I watched his expression. It was not the smile of a man amused, but of one gently wary, the way a conductor might pause before the first note, aware the music to come may not be entirely in tune. The following morning, over warm croissants and black coffee, I broached the subject once more. "You say you knew Lady Eleanor, Poirot." He dabbed at the corner of his mouth with his napkin, nodding. "Not intimately, mon ami, but enough to recognize the construction of her soul. She was a woman of elegance, yes, but also of discipline. Her world must be composed, harmonized. She despises disorder, not only in her music, but in her affairs. And yet she invites you now. There is a reason, Hastings. Always, she does not indulge in social whims. Her invitations are fugues, not improvisations. Note how she does not mention a case, a problem, a crime. Only a matter of private refinement. That is the phrase that sings." He looked contemplatively into his cup. "Music, Hastings, is often used to distract from silence, but sometimes it is the silence itself we must listen to." The rain had begun to tap gently against the window panes, and I felt it then, the quiet tension of something approaching, not a storm precisely, but a change in the air. We departed the following afternoon by motor car, Poirot seated beside me, with gloved hands neatly folded in his lap, his moustaches waxed to defiant perfection despite the dampness. The countryside rolled past us in gentle undulations of green and gold, hedgerows and dry stone walls, giving way to the occasional church spire or weathered gatepost. Poirot was uncharacteristically quiet for some time, until a particular bend in the road seemed to stir him. "These weekends of music," he said at last, "they are not as innocent as they appear. Do you know why the English are so fond of them?" "Because they enjoy music." I ventured, "Mais non, because they enjoy concealment." A musical gathering provides an alibi for every silence, a justification for every locked door. People do not ask why you are melancholic, they assume Chopin. They do not question why you vanish, they suppose a rehearsal. You think someone is hiding something. "I think," he said softly, "someone wants a veil of harmony over what is perhaps a very discordant truth." I said nothing more as we drove on. the road narrowing now, the trees older and more twisted. The sign to Greystone appeared suddenly, and we turned. Greystone Manor rose from the landscape with the weary dignity of an aging soprano, proud still but with the strain of former glory at its foundations. Ivy clung thickly to its stone facade, almost protective in its grip, while tall chimneys reached skyward like organ pipes waiting to sound. The gravel drive crunched beneath the wheels as we approached the entrance. A butler, expressionless, spare as a stem, stood waiting, flanked by two great urns now emptied of summer. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Do you feel it, Hastings?" "What?" "The hush, not of peace, of something restrained." And as I looked upon that house, with its windows like watching eyes and its roof darkened with age, I thought, for a fleeting moment, that it did not welcome us. It permitted us, and only for now. We were shown into the drawing-room, where Lady Eleanor stood by the fireplace, hands clasped before her, in a manner that seemed more ceremonial than welcoming. She was tall, angular, and possessed of a beauty that time had not erased, only refined, like a sculpture more compelling for its cracks. "Monsieur Dos," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "Thank you for coming." Poirot bowed. "It is an honor, Lady Eleanor. You look, as ever, in command." "A command, Mr. Poirot, can be a very fragile thing. Sometimes one only maintains it by pretending not to notice the cracks." She offered a ghost of a smile and gestured for us to sit. "I will not waste your time. There is to be a weekend of music here, but it is more than that. There are relationships that require careful arrangement, and I find myself no longer certain who is conducting whom." Poirot inclined his head slightly. A question not of melody but of motive. Her eyes met his, cool and deliberate. "Yes, exactly." And though she said no more, I felt then that we had not been invited merely to enjoy a recital, but to detect the sour note that someone somewhere had tried to silence. That evening, after we had unpacked and taken a light supper, Poirot and I wandered through the east corridor, where portraits of long-dead Talbots lined the walls like disapproving witnesses to the present. "There is something about this place," I muttered. "Too quiet, too arranged," Poirot corrected. "It is the difference, mon ami, between silence and suppression." We found ourselves near the music room, its doors slightly ajar, as though the house itself exhaled through the gap. Inside, the grand piano gleamed, recently dusted, but Poirot's eyes were drawn to a pale rectangle on the shelf beside it, the mark of something once present, now conspicuously absent. "A photograph has been removed," he said quietly, "perhaps cleaned, perhaps hidden." As we turned to leave, a maid brushed past us, her eyes downcast, her lips pressed tight. Poirot murmured, "She fears something, or someone." That night, the house settled around us like a theatre, awaiting its first act, but not a note had been played, and still the silence deepened. The following afternoon found us gathered in the drawing-room once more, though this time not as quiet observers, but participants in what Lady Eleanor herself described as an informal gathering of sympathetic minds. The phrase struck me as oddly chosen. There was little of the sympathetic in the air, more a brittle cordiality, as though each guest wore civility like a borrowed cloak. Poirot and I stood near the marble fireplace, introduced one by one to the assembled guests, each of whom regarded us with that peculiar mixture of interest and reserve, which is the mark of tight-knit circles disturbed. Lady Eleanor made the rounds with practised elegance. "You must meet Mr. Lionel Markham, a brilliant if temperamental composer, and Miss Claudia Brent, formidable with the violin and quite impossible without it." Her voice carried a note too polished to be affectionate. "Mr. Richard Vale, our tenor of continental acclaim, and of course Arthur Morel, who hardly needs introduction, our pianist in residence, and finally, my niece Celeste. They each nodded or murmured some acknowledgment. It was a curious ensemble, like instruments still in their cases, closed tightly, each waiting to be played, but unwilling to yield their notes just yet. Mr. Lionel Markham stood apart from the others, his lean frame clad in dark wool that matched the gauntness of his face. He had the look of a man who suffered inspiration rather than courted it. When Lady Eleanor spoke of him as temperamental, she had spoken the truth, though perhaps not the whole of it. He nodded to Poirot with the smallest movement, then turned his attention back to the window, where the light fell across the ivy in tangled patterns. His silence was not inattentive. On the contrary, he was listening to what I could not say. Conversations, footfalls, the inner workings of his mind. Poirot observed him with subtle admiration. An interesting man, Hastings. He watches like a conductor listens, for rhythm, for tension. I glanced over. You think him suspicious? Not yet. But he is not at ease. He is waiting for something, or for someone to slip. It occurred to me then that Markham had scarcely spoken more than 2 words since our arrival, and yet, somehow he had made his presence felt with greater weight than many a man far more loquacious. Miss Claudia Brent made no effort to conceal her disdain for the gathering. She was a woman in her early 40s, with sharp features and sharper eyes, the sort that assess rather than observe. Her dress was simple but unkindly cut, and she wore her violin case like a soldier might carry a sidearm, not for display, but defense. When Lady Eleanor introduced us, she offered a thin smile that held not a trace of warmth. "Another pair of ears to endure the rehearsals, I see," she said. "Do try not to wince too visibly if we strike a wrong note, or rather, when we do." Her eyes lingered a moment too long on Arthur Morrel, who stood across the room, his gaze fixed somewhere just beyond her shoulder. Poirot inclined his head gently. "I am sure your interpretation will be very fine, mademoiselle." Claudia's lips curled faintly. "Interpretation is all we're left with, Monsieur Poirot, once brilliance has departed. There was pain there, yes, but not recent pain. It was the sort of bitterness that had set like varnish over years of insult, loss or disappointment, and it was directed with unnerving precision. Richard Vail, by contrast, was charm made flesh. He moved through the gathering like a breeze through drapes, smooth, unobtrusive, and impossible to pin down. His features were handsomely symmetrical, his voice tinged with a faint Mediterranean warmth, though his vowels were Oxford-educated. He had the smile of a man used to being desired, and the discipline to use it sparingly. He greeted us with effortless civility. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, I'm flattered to share company with such luminaries, though I do fear you'll find our modest efforts a touch underwhelming." Poirot smiled back. "On the contrary, I find modesty, when genuine, to be most rare and refreshing." Richard chuckled. "And when it is neither, then it is merely camouflage." It was not lost on me that as he spoke, Richard cast a glance, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably marked, towards Celeste, seated quietly by the window. It was not the glance of a man in love, nor of guilt. It was the glance of someone trying not to look, and failing. Poirot noted it too. "That man," he murmured, "has a secret not on his tongue but behind his eyes." Arthur Morrel was the only one who looked like he did not wish to be there at all. He was a tall man with thinning hair and a face marked by sleepless nights. His left hand, I noticed, trembled ever so slightly as he lit a cigarette, not a tremor of age, but of memory, the kind that settles in the bones when the mind has seen too much. He offered no pleasantries, merely a polite nod when introduced, then resumed his place by the piano, where he sat for several minutes, not playing, not speaking, just resting his fingers lightly on the closed lid. Poirot approached with quiet reverence. "You have known the war, I think?" he asked gently. Arthur looked up, startled. "Everyone has, but some more intimately than others." Arthur gave a thin, sardonic smile. "Do you also read palms, Monsieur Poirot?" "No," Poirot said softly. "But I observe hands, and yours have played things no man should have had to endure." There was no reply, but in that moment I saw something shift in Morel, not trust, but recognition, and perhaps the relief of having been seen. And then there was Celeste. She sat apart from the others, curled into the corner of a faded damask chair, as if hoping the fabric might fold in on itself and take her with it. She was a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, with delicate features that held a striking resemblance to no one in particular, and eyes that belonged to someone far older than her years. She did not rise when we were introduced, only nodded with a stiff awkwardness and looked quickly away. Her hands, I noticed, rested on the arms of the chair, fingers half curled, as though always ready to retreat. "She is shy," Lady Eleanor said quietly, "and not accustomed to gatherings." "Or to music?" Poirot asked. Lady Eleanor paused. "No, she plays beautifully, but she listens even more keenly." Poirot turned toward her, "And yet she does not speak." I could not tell whether it was fear or grief that haunted the girl, perhaps both. But as Poirot studied her, his gaze softened. "There is pain here, Hastings," he said later, as we made our way back to our rooms, "but also talent. And talent, when buried, becomes dangerous, like dynamite beneath a rose garden." And thus the stage was set, the instruments tuned, the performers in place. But it would not be music we'd be listening for in the days to come, it would be dissonance. The next morning the house stirred with the promise of purpose, or at least the performance of it. At Lady Eleanor's insistence, the first formal rehearsal was to commence promptly at 10 o'clock, and by 1:15, all were gathered in the music room, a long, high-ceilinged space whose faded grandeur bore witness to the decades of applause that once echoed there. Light poured through the tall windows, illuminating the floating dust with almost holy solemnity, and the room was lined with tall mirrors that reflected not only the performers, but the tensions they could not suppress. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle around the grand piano, which sat like an altar in the center of the room. Arthur Morel adjusted the bench with a mechanical air, while Claudia Brent took her time tuning her violin, the strings whining under the pressure of her fingers. Richard Vail stood at the side, humming softly to himself, a man rehearsing charm as much as melody. Lionel Markham hovered near the music stand, arms crossed, scribbling something in a dog-eared notebook. Poirot and I sat discreetly in the far corner. He did not speak, he merely watched, not the rehearsal, not the notes, but the faces behind them. When the first notes sounded, there was a moment, a single fleeting moment of unity. Claudia's violin led with aching elegance, followed delicately by the piano and the faint undertone of Vail's voice as he prepared to join the passage. But scarcely had the music begun to weave its spell than the spell was broken. A hesitation, a pause, a frown. Arthur's hands trembled, imperceptibly perhaps, to the untrained eye, but to Poirot it might as well have been thunder. The rhythm slackened. Claudia adjusted her tempo, but it was too late. Richard stepped in too soon, then stopped entirely, biting back a curse under his breath. Lionel looked up from the sheet music with a withering expression. They began again, but the same strain re-emerged. The harmony disintegrated not because of error, but because of emotion, each player seemingly wrestling with something unsaid, something deeper than musical dissonance. Poirot leaned toward me and whispered, "This is not rehearsal, Hastings. It is confession, without words. I watched the expressions of the players. Vale was too smooth, Claudia too brittle, Arthur too lost. The music was not failing because of their skill. It was being choked by the weight of something older than this room. Suddenly, with the bow still mid-air, Claudia Brent snapped, "Oh, for God's sake, Arthur, if your hands are incapable, just say so." The words echoed sharply in the vaulted room. All sound ceased. Arthur turned his head slowly, but said nothing. His fingers twitched slightly on the edge of the keys, then curled inward. "Every rehearsal it's the same," Claudia continued, rising from her chair. "Tentative fumbling, and then that insufferable silence. If you've lost the nerve, then don't make the rest of us suffer for it." Lady Eleanor, who had been seated near the doorway, stiffened but did not intervene. It was Lionel who cleared his throat with affected patience. But Claudia had not finished. "You know what this performance means, don't you? It isn't just another soirée. You knew, Arthur, and still you let your ghosts play in your place." Arthur's reply, when it came, was no more than a murmur. "I'd rather play beside my ghosts than next to your bitterness." There it was, the fracture that had only been hinted at before. Claudia's face hardened, but beneath the contempt was something more dangerous, injury. And from injury, I knew, came rage. It was then that Lionel Markham spoke, not with force, but with a coldness that stilled the air far more effectively than shouting. "This is becoming tiresome," he said, without looking up from his score. "Claudia, your indignation is as predictable as your phrasing. Arthur, your frailty, while tragic, is not unique. Might we return to the rehearsal, or must we continue this rather unmusical theatre?" Claudia glared at him. "At least I feel something when I play." "Yes," Lionel replied, glancing up with steely amusement. "And we all suffer for it." Poirot turned to me with a slight lift of his brows. "You see, Hastings, no one raises their voice without bleeding. But Markham, he draws blood in silence." I could not help but agree. The composer's words were not angry. They were surgical. As rehearsal resumed, if one could call it that, Poirot's gaze drifted to the three most volatile figures in the room: Claudia, Arthur, and Richard. Their triangle was drawn not with geometry, but with resentment and something more intimate. Claudia refused to look at Arthur. Arthur would not look at anyone. Richard, meanwhile, drifted like smoke between them, never quite landing, never quite free. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot murmured. "There is familiarity here, and history, but it is no longer harmonious. These three, they have shared something. A stage, yes, but also a secret. You think one of them—" "Show," he whispered. "Look at their eyes, not where they look, but where they refuse to look. That tells you everything." Indeed, Claudia's jaw was set whenever Arthur struck a key. Arthur flinched each time Richard approached, and Richard, for all his easy grace, flitted glances toward Lady Eleanor more often than made sense for a mere guest. Whatever music they had once made together had long since turned to silence, or worse, to noise. It was just after a particularly strained attempt at the Schubert when the tremor broke. Celeste, seated quietly in the corner with her sheet music unopened on her lap, rose suddenly. Her chair made a soft scraping sound that nonetheless cut through the room like a blade. "I think I must excuse myself," she said softly, not waiting for permission, as she slipped past the piano and out the door. No one spoke, but Poirot stood a fraction straighter, his eyes following her until the door closed behind her. "She is trembling," he said, "and yet she has played no note. Stage fright?" "No, Hastings," he said gravely. "Remorse, or perhaps revelation." The room resumed its motions, but the music did not recover. It was later that day, under a pale and heavy sky, that Poirot suggested we take a turn in the gardens. The light had dimmed to a muted grey, the kind of English overcast that muffled colour and blurred time. There was a deceptive peace in the air, the kind that holds its breath. Greystone's gardens, like the house, were composed with meticulous care, though age had begun to erode their edges. Box hedges stood in near military formation, and paths of crushed shell wound like staves through a manuscript. The wind stirred nothing, the birds had gone oddly quiet. I strolled beside my friend, commenting idly on the sculpted urns and moss-covered sundials, but Poirot was not attending. His eyes, narrowed and alert, roved not over the blooms, but through the silences, the places where footsteps had crushed the lawn, where a gate latch had recently turned. It was not leisure he sought, but something far more elusive. "In gardens, Hastings," he murmured, "truth is often whispered more freely than in drawing-rooms." We had reached a quiet stretch of yew topiary when Poirot lifted a hand, silencing me, his head tilted slightly. Somewhere beyond the clipped green, two voices, faint, hushed, urgent, threaded through the leaves. "It mustn't come out. Not after all this time. I'm not the one bringing it back to life. You invited him." The voices were a man's and a woman's, not strangers, but recognizable if one had the patience. One pleaded, the other reproached. The tones were veiled in restraint, but not coldness. There was familiarity in their cadence, and resentment. Poirot did not move. He simply listened. I, unaware of anything but his sudden stillness, peered curiously at a nesting robin nearby and said nothing. "If he finds out, it will destroy everything. Not just for me." A pause. "Forgiveness doesn't mean immunity." Another pause. "Then it must remain buried." The wind picked up, rustling the hedges. The voices ceased. Poirot drew a quiet breath. His posture shifted. The moment was gone. "Come, mon ami," he said, his tone light, but his expression unreadable. "Let us examine the roses." As we continued our walk along the hedge-lined path, Poirot remained uncharacteristically quiet. I assumed it was the effect of the weather, which had turned faintly damp, but in truth I had become used to such silences, not empty but reflective. Poirot's mind, I knew, was sorting impressions like notes into a scale. He repeated one phrase to himself, almost inaudibly. "It must remain buried." "What was that?" I asked. "Nothing, Hastings." A thought, or perhaps an echo. Though he did not name the speakers, I saw that he was replaying the conversation like a piece of music, listening to the rhythm, the phrasing, the intervals between the words. He was memorizing not what was said, but how it was said. The guilty intonation, the balance of power, the subtle shift from plea to threat. "Vienna," he murmured. "What about it?" I recall a performance there, Mozart's Requiem in the Karlskirche. The sound rose like confession. Do you know what made it so powerful?" I shook my head. There was no applause, only silence. The silence that follows when something sacred, or dangerous, is unearthed. He did not elaborate. As we rounded the gravel path, I found myself distracted by the rose garden, or rather what remained of it. The late summer blooms had begun to wilt, petals drooping like regretful sighs. Several bushes showed signs of rot, their stems blackened, their blooms crumbling at the touch. "Not quite the show Lady Eleanor promised," I remarked, crouching to inspect one particularly weary blossom. "They've been neglected." Poirot cast a glance toward them, but said nothing. He continued walking slowly, as if counting the distance between benches or measuring the intervals between footsteps. "I suppose beauty, like music, has its season," I added. He stopped, turned back, and looked at the bush I had touched. Hastings, you observe well, but not enough. These roses have not merely faded, they have been over-pruned, controlled, shaped to appear alive long after their time. I stared. You mean? He shook his head. No theory yet. But note this, mon ami, even in gardens, what is cut away leaves a mark. We turned down a narrow passage lined with overgrown lavender, intending to return toward the south terrace. As we passed a gap in the hedgerow, Poirot halted mid-stride and tilted his head ever so slightly. Two figures, partially obscured, emerged from the far end of the garden walk. Their words were lost to distance, but their urgency was palpable. The woman clutched a pale silk scarf around her neck. The man leaned close, gesturing with agitation. Poirot drew his hand to my arm to still me. The two paused briefly in the path. The woman turned, and though her face was shielded by her hat, the edge of her scarf slipped, revealing a distinctive embroidery along its hem, a musical motif. Just as quickly they parted. She disappeared toward the eastern rose arch. He walked briskly in the opposite direction, his polished shoes catching the damp light of the gravel, black patent, slightly scuffed on the outer toe. Poirot made no sound, but his eyes narrowed. "Not yet enough," he murmured. "But it is a beginning." We returned to the house just before the rain began, and soon found ourselves seated in the drawing-room, where Lady Eleanor had ordered tea laid out with predictable elegance. China of Wedgwood blue, sandwiches in perfect triangles, and not a teaspoon out of place. Poirot stirred his cup with meticulous calm, but his thoughts were not with the tea. "Hastings," he said finally, "do you recall what I told you once about agreements made in whispers, that they are usually broken?" "No, that they are usually lies dressed in discretion." He set down his spoon and leaned back. "This garden, it grows more than flowers. It cultivates illusions. Apologies are rehearsed, affections are edited, and secrets, they are pressed into the soil, hoping never to rise again." I nodded slowly. "And yet," he smiled faintly, "the soil remembers, mon ami, even when the gardener does not." He raised his cup, but his eyes never left the garden beyond the glass. By the hour of 7, Greystone's music room had been transformed. What had earlier served as a rehearsal space rife with discontent was now a scene of cultivated elegance. The chandelier above had been dimmed to a low amber glow, and candlelight danced in silver sconces along the panelled walls, casting the faces of the assembled audience in soft relief. It was not merely light, but atmosphere. Lady Eleanor knew precisely how to stage a moment. Chairs had been arranged in a semicircle before the grand piano, where music stands gleamed and a velvet-covered bench waited, ominously empty. The scent of beeswax mingled with lavender. A hush had fallen across the gathering, the sort one might mistake for reverence. But Poirot, standing beside me near the back, observed otherwise. "Très bien arranged," he murmured. "But the elegance, Hastings, it is too precise. It has the effect not of serenity, but concealment." Guests filtered in, murmuring pleasantries. Lady Eleanor moved among them like a conductor without baton. She did not smile often, only enough to suggest she remembered how, and beneath the sheen of refinement, something else lingered, as though the very walls were listening for the first wrong note. As the audience took their seats, a subtle change came over the room. The murmur of conversation faded, but the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was taut, as though every guest, every performer, was aware of a second audience, one invisible and uninvited. I scanned the room. Claudia Brent sat rigid, her violin already poised, though no cue had yet been given. Her jaw was clenched, her gaze focused not on the score but on Arthur Morel. Richard Vale stood behind his chair, casually adjusting his cufflinks, but his eyes kept drifting towards Celeste, seated among the guests, her face pale and unreadable. Arthur, meanwhile, paced slowly near the piano, his fingers flexing at his sides. I saw the tremor again, not constant, but sudden and unpredictable. When he caught Poirot's eye, he paused and gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Yes, I know you see it too." Poirot leaned close to me. "You feel it, Hastings? That undercurrent? It is not nerves. It is anticipation of something that cannot be undone once it begins." And as the musicians took their places, I realized he was right. It was not the music we feared, it was what the music might reveal. The first notes emerged like fog over water, tentative, suspended, impossibly delicate. Claudia led with her bow, the violin's voice high and mournful, before yielding to the deeper resonance of the cello and the almost imperceptible entrance of Richard Vale's voice, restrained and reverent. Arthur Morel, seated at the piano, waited precisely 3 bars before beginning. His touch was feather-light, his movements precise, almost detached. To any untrained observer, his performance would have appeared immaculate. But Poirot's eyes missed nothing. I, too, began to see it, the hesitations too brief to be mistakes, the pauses too smooth to be spontaneous. Arthur played as one might walk across ice. Gracefully, yes, but with the constant awareness that beneath him waited something treacherous. Poirot whispered, "He plays not to express, but to survive." And then a flicker. Arthur's left hand hesitated a fraction of a beat too long, his right attempting to compensate. Claudia's eyes narrowed. Lionel, conducting with the subtlest of gestures from the side, stiffened imperceptibly. Even Richard's voice faltered. The harmony held, but just barely. The music was no longer a performance. It had become a question, and Arthur was no longer certain of the answer. It happened not with drama, but with the kind of quiet catastrophe one only recognizes after it has passed. The quartet had entered its 3rd movement, a passage of exquisite tension, all minor chords and suspended resolutions, when Arthur Morel struck a wrong note. Not slightly wrong, not subtly off, a note that did not belong. There was a half-second of stunned silence from the performers, not the audience, who assumed it to be some modern dissonance, but Claudia froze mid-bow. Richard's voice caught in his throat. Arthur's hands paused above the keys, then trembled violently, and then with a strange slow motion that did not resemble collapse so much as surrender, Arthur slumped forward. His head fell against the piano with a dull metallic chord, a sound both accidental and final. The audience gasped as one. The last note echoed, a dissonant cry, reverberating off the walls before being swallowed by silence. Poirot did not move, but I felt him tense beside me. Lady Eleanor rose from her seat, and in the air thick with candle smoke and perfume, something darker had arrived. A truth long silenced, now struck in one shattering key. The room erupted into a confusion of whispers, rising voices, and movement. Lady Eleanor, pale but composed, stepped forward. "Get Dr. Ellsworth," she said calmly to a footman. Immediately, Richard was already at Arthur's side, gripping his shoulder and shaking gently. "Arthur, Arthur, do you hear me?" His voice was hoarse, urgent, stripped of its usual polish. Claudia had not moved. Her violin lay across her lap, untouched, her expression unreadable. Poirot approached without haste, parting the cluster around the piano with a quiet authority. I followed, uncertain of what I could do but needing to be near. Arthur's body had gone slack, his right hand still resting near the low E key. One eye had drifted half shut. The other was clouded with something far more permanent than sleep. "He was fine earlier," Richard murmured. "A little anxious, yes, but not this." Poirot placed a hand gently on Richard's arm. "Do not disturb him further, monsieur." Richard looked up sharply. "You mean—" Poirot gave a single nod. You must let him rest now. There is nothing more to be done." It was then I saw Lady Eleanor standing very still by the window. Her gaze was not on Arthur. It was on the empty music stand and whatever had once been written upon it. Before the doctor arrived, Poirot moved closer to the piano. With great care he bent down beside Arthur's lifeless figure, tilting his head to examine the line of the man's mouth, the pallor of the skin. He touched nothing, not yet, but observed with the reverence of a man deciphering an unfinished score. "His color is wrong," Poirot murmured. I looked more closely. "You mean death?" No, that I expect. But see, the flush at the throat, the pulse at the temple, just now fading. This was not a heart weakened by age or wine, Hastings. It is sudden, violent, and unnatural. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a monogrammed handkerchief, placing it gently beneath Arthur's head to ease him from the instrument. Then, from a lower shelf beneath the piano, he retrieved the man's water glass, half full. He sniffed. "Lime," he said, "and something else, not citrus, something metallic." "You think?" Poirot raised one finger. "I do not think yet. I only note." He glanced toward the door, where footsteps could be heard. The doctor at last. "Let them declare what they will," he said quietly. "But Hastings, we have begun." Dr. Ellsworth arrived some 20 minutes after the collapse, his coat flapping in the wind and his spectacles already fogged from haste. He was a practical man, of that sort who carries about him the air of having been summoned to worse than whatever awaits. After a brief examination, he straightened, removed his glasses, and delivered his verdict in clipped, unceremonious tones. "Massive cardiac failure," he declared. "Unfortunate, but not entirely unexpected. I treated Morel last winter for elevated blood pressure. The strain of performance likely proved too much." Lady Eleanor inclined her head, the picture of controlled sorrow. Several guests began murmuring their assent, as though grateful for the simplicity of the diagnosis. One could almost feel the collective urge to return to the safety of explanation, but Poirot, standing apart from the others, said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on the floor where Arthur had fallen. He watched not the man, but the space he had left behind, as if measuring the outline of an absence. As the doctor busied himself writing a note for the authorities, more bureaucratic formality than medical necessity, Poirot and I stepped into the adjoining anteroom. "Well, there you are," I offered, attempting a measure of comfort. "A tragedy, yes, but not a mystery." He turned to me slowly, brows gently lifted. "Non monima, it is precisely the reverse." I blinked. "You think it wasn't a heart attack?" "I think," he said carefully, "that the timing of the collapse, the unnatural stillness before it, and above all the expression that lingered upon the poor man's face, they do not belong to the quiet exit of a worn heart." I frowned. "What then?" Poirot leaned closer. "There is nothing more suspicious," he said softly, "than a death which arrives at the exact moment it is most inconvenient." Returning quietly to the now deserted music room, Poirot made his way to the piano. The body had been removed, but the glass Arthur Morel had used remained on a tray beside the bench, untouched, unnoticed, and half full. Poirot examined it with fastidious care, holding it to the light. "Lime cordial," he murmured, "but not quite." He handed the glass to me. "Smell, Hastings." I did, and immediately wrinkled my nose. There was a faint metallic note beneath the citrus, not overpowering, but jarring, like iron shavings soaked in sugar. Poirot turned to a footman waiting awkwardly by the door. "Pardon, monsieur. May I trouble you? Was this drink poured during the intermission or before the performance? I believe Mr. Morel requested it shortly before taking his seat, the man said nervously. But it was Miss Brent who handed it to him. Ah, Poirot gave a tiny nod. Merci. He turned back to the piano, but his mind, I knew, was already far from it. Later that evening, as the house settled into a strained hush, Poirot requested a private word with Lady Eleanor. She received us in the library, where the fire crackled with a little too much vigor, and the scent of oversteeped tea clung to the air. Madame, Poirot said gently, it is my custom, following the death of any guest in unusual circumstances, to make a few inquiries. Lady Eleanor gave a small courteous nod. Of course. Tell me, he continued, who arranged the refreshments before the performance. She hesitated, barely, and then said, Cook laid out the tray. Claudia Brent offered to take it in. She and Arthur had known each other many years. Indeed, and no one else touched the glass. She looked away, just for a moment. When she turned back, her face was composed again, but her fingers twisted the folds of her shawl. I can't say, there was a great deal happening. And Arthur, he wasn't himself. Poirot said nothing, but I noticed her voice had grown hoarse, and for the first time she looked tired. Arthur's belongings, Poirot said later, as we crossed the corridor, are they still here, do you suppose? I imagine so, I replied. He was staying in the east wing. There's a study adjoining his room. Poirot's step quickened. Moments later, we stood before a narrow door set with a tarnished brass handle. He turned it, and found it locked. Curious, he murmured. I knocked. There was no answer. Lady Eleanor appeared at the end of the corridor, her footsteps sharp against the wood. Monsieur Poirot. Forgive me, madame, he said, but I should like to examine Mr. Morel's study. It is locked. She drew a key from her chain without hesitation, though I noted how her fingers trembled just before offering it. Of course, she said, I had it secured after his collapse. For privacy, Poirot accepted the key with a slight bow, then opened the door, and we stepped inside. The study was modest, its walls lined with music manuscripts and a few well-thumbed volumes of poetry. A lamp had been left on, its light soft, almost reverent. On the desk lay an open folio of sheet music, a pen, and a bottle of ink. A metronome ticked softly in the corner, as if refusing to acknowledge death. Poirot's eyes scanned the room, not for the obvious, but the absent. There, he said, pointing to the mahogany desk. See the dust outline. Indeed, a rectangular space on the surface, just beside the ink blotter, bore the clean-edged mark of something that had recently stood there. A frame, no doubt. Someone removed a photograph, I said. Poirot nodded, and did so in haste. See, the paper beneath is untouched, but the surface was not cleaned. Someone wanted it gone, not tidy. He looked around the room again, eyes narrowing. Now, Hastings, the question is not what it showed, it is why someone feared we might see it. As we stepped back into the corridor, Poirot paused by the door and rested one hand against the frame. In every death, Hastings, there is a story. Some are written in the heart, others in the details removed. He gestured toward the study behind us. That photograph, it was not simply sentimental. It was significant, a symbol of connection, perhaps of shame, perhaps of legacy. He turned to me, eyes sharper than ever. It is the object that is missing which sings the loudest. And this one, mon ami, it screams. He said nothing more, but I felt it then, the beginning of truth, faint as the overture before a storm. The morning following Arthur Morel's death dawned damp and subdued. Rain fretted against the windows like a pianist striking the same broken chord again and again. Breakfast was taken in silence. Conversation, where it existed at all, was cautious, brittle, and devoid of appetite. By noon, Poirot had made his intention clear. The guests would remain at Greystone until further notice, and he would speak with each of them individually. Lady Eleanor, though clearly fatigued, offered no protest. If anything, she seemed oddly relieved to relinquish the pretense of hospitality. Poirot chose the library for his inquiries, not merely for its quiet, but because it was a room of memory, its walls lined with brittle pages and forgotten truths. I sat nearby, notebook in hand, but said little. It was not my turn to question. Poirot began with the violinist, and as Claudia Brent entered the room, her chin tilted in defiance, the door clicked softly shut behind her, and the performance began anew. Claudia seated herself with all the grace of a swordsman taking position. Upright, defensive, armed. She declined tea, ignored my presence, and met Poirot's gaze with a half-smile that did not reach her eyes. "You wish to know whether I killed Arthur," she said. "The answer is no, though I admit I might have dreamed it once or twice." Poirot inclined his head. "Dreams are not crimes, mademoiselle, but often they leave impressions on the waking mind." She snorted delicately. "Arthur Morel was a fraud. Talented, yes, in the way a parasite is talented at surviving. He played other people's pain as though it were his own, and the world applauded." "You played together before?" Poirot asked gently. "Years ago, before Vienna, before everything changed." There it was again, Vienna. Poirot let the silence draw out. "Miss Brent," he said softly, "did you hand Mr. Morel his drink last night?" She did not blink. "I did." He looked pale. "I thought it might help." "A kindness?" he asked. Her mouth curled. "An obligation." She rose, smoothed her skirt, and left without another word. Lionel Markham entered as if to a boardroom, his steps soundless, his expression unreadable. He settled into the chair opposite Poirot with calculated calm. "You did not like Morel," Poirot began. "I didn't dislike him," Markham replied. "He was a necessary component. Like a chord." Markham allowed a brief smile. "More like a dissonance that resolved nicely in certain keys." He described the evening in stark, clipped phrases, nothing poetic, no speculation. He had seen Arthur take his seat, heard the music falter, seen the fall. "And what did you feel, monsieur, at that moment?" Poirot asked. Markham looked past him, as though observing something only he could see. "Relief," he said, "but not for his death, for the silence that followed it." Poirot nodded once. "Merci." As Markham departed, Poirot muttered, "The man composes in more than one sense. Even his grief is scored to tempo." Richard Vale entered with less swagger than usual. His voice, though still smooth, was quieter, subdued. He accepted a cup of tea, stirred it without tasting it, and sat with his hands folded carefully in his lap. "Poirot," he said after a pause, "I won't insult you with denial. Yes, I had a relationship with Arthur." Poirot made no visible reaction. "Was it ongoing?" Richard shook his head. "It ended, quietly, bitterly, last year. We remained professional. Barely." "Why did it end?" He hesitated. "Because he couldn't choose between the past and the present, between art and affection. Lady Eleanor was unaware. I think she suspected, but she never asked." Poirot studied him. "And were you angry with him still?" "Angry? No. Tired of pretending? Yes. But I had no reason to harm him, Poirot. Not any more. People rarely kill for reasons they admit to themselves, monsieur," Poirot murmured. Richard looked up then. truly looked at Poirot. "If I were going to poison him," he said, "I would have chosen something quieter than lime cordial." And with that he rose and left, the cup untouched. Celeste arrived last. She entered hesitantly, her pale hands clasped before her, eyes darting nervously to the curtained windows. She sat without being asked, her shoulders folding inward like wings afraid to spread. Poirot softened his tone. "Mademoiselle," he said, "I do not wish to frighten you, but you knew Mr. Morel, did you not?" She nodded. "Since I was little, he visited Greystone many times. He used to bring me chocolates." Her voice trembled. "Did you see him before the performance?" Yes, in the corridor," he said. I had grown." Poirot leaned forward. "And what did you feel, hearing that?" She looked down. "I felt frightened, but I don't know why." "Did you love him?" "No." "Did you hate him?" Her eyes welled suddenly, and she shook her head. "I don't know what I felt. I only knew something was wrong. Everyone else pretended not to notice. But I heard it, in the way they spoke to him, in the way he looked at the piano." Poirot said nothing, and in that stillness, her fear bloomed like a wound exposed to light. When the last guest had departed, and the library returned to its old hush, Poirot sat back, hands steepled before him, his eyes on the Persian rug beneath his feet. I waited. "Well?" I asked finally. He looked up slowly. "They all lie, Hastings, but not in the way one expects." I frowned. "You mean they're hiding something?" "Mais bien sûr, but what they hide is not guilt, not all of them. What they conceal is the shape of their grief. Each has rehearsed their truth, like actors learning lines for a part they no longer believe in." He rose, walking slowly to the window. "You noticed it, perhaps. Their emotions are correct, but misplaced. Claudia's anger is not for last night. Markham's detachment, it masks more than apathy. Richard's confession was too polished. And the girl, she carries not guilt, but knowledge. That is the most dangerous burden of all." Outside, the rain had stopped. A single drop lingered on the window pane, trembling, refusing to fall. "They spoke of music," Poirot murmured, "but none of them listened to what was between the notes." And as he turned back to me, I saw it in his eyes. The melody had changed. It was past 10, and the corridors of Greystone had settled into uneasy quiet when the knock came. Poirot, still impeccably groomed and brushing a speck of dust from his lapel, looked up from the armchair where he'd been silently reviewing his notes. I opened the door. Miss Claudia Brent stood there. No longer the acerbic grande dame of the violin, but a woman stripped bare of her armors. Her face was ashen, the sharp angles of her cheekbones more prominent than ever. Her hands trembled slightly, though her voice, when she spoke, remained unnervingly clear. "I must speak with Mem Poirot," she said. "Alone, if you please." Poirot gestured toward the chair opposite his own, nodding gravely. I hesitated, but he gave me a subtle look, not dismissal precisely, but restraint. I withdrew to the corner, silent and unobtrusive, as Claudia lowered herself into the seat, spine stiff with something older than guilt. "I killed Arthur Morel," she said without preamble, as though the sentence had been rehearsed on an eternal loop in her mind. "Not out of hatred, not precisely, but because he took something that could not be returned." Poirot did not interrupt her. She continued, voice low and bitter. "In Vienna, 20 years ago, I wrote a piece, a small suite. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. I shared it with Arthur, foolishly. I thought he admired me. I thought we were—" She paused, swallowing her pride. "Equals." Her gaze became distant. "A year later, he played my music at a salon in Budapest. The form was rearranged, the cadences softened, the signature changed. But it was mine, and everyone applauded, No one remembered Claudia Brent, only Arthur Morell, her fingers knotted into fists. I watched him climb. I watched as he grew famous on borrowed genius. I remained the bitter afterthought, the fading violinist. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did. Poirot remained motionless, only the faintest furrow to his brow. I saw my chance, she whispered. He always drank lime cordial before a performance. I laced the first glass myself, with aconitine. It's subtle, if you know the dose. And with that, she fell silent. I see, said Poirot gently. You are brave, mademoiselle. Few have the courage to wear their truth so openly. Claudia blinked, surprised perhaps by the lack of reproach. And when did you prepare the drink? He asked softly. Just after luncheon. I saw his glass left on the tray in the salon. No one was around. I used gloves. Poirot inclined his head, fingers lightly tapping his own wrist. And you are certain he drank from that glass? Yes, he always did. It was a ritual. He nodded again, eyes thoughtful. And you acquired the aconitine. How? She faltered then. It was left from years ago. I had intended it for myself once, in Vienna. Poirot gave no visible sign of emotion. Forgive me, mademoiselle, but I must press for accuracy, you understand. She merely nodded, exhausted. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes now fixed on her with that singular intensity I had come to recognize, the moment before truth emerges like a ship through mist. Mademoiselle, he said quietly, there is one detail that troubles me. Claudia stiffened. You said you tampered with the drink after luncheon, and yet, according to the servant who brought the tray into the music room, Mr. Morell specifically requested a fresh glass only minutes before the performance began. She froze. I asked the footman myself. He was puzzled, but complied. He took away the untouched glass and brought a new one directly from the kitchen, witnessed by 2 other staff members. Claudia's lips parted, but no sound came. Poirot's voice was kind, but implacable, which means, mademoiselle, that whatever was in the first glass he never drank it. She stared at him, the color draining further from her face. So, he concluded, either your confession is not the truth, or your memory deceives you. Her hands flew to her mouth. No, I wanted to. I meant to. But Poirot raised a hand gently. There is no shame in not killing, mademoiselle, only in pretending to know what one did not do. Claudia broke then, not dramatically, no sobs or wails, just a shudder, a cracking exhale, and the slow collapse of a woman whose fury had sustained her for far too long. I hated him, she whispered. I wanted him dead. Does that not make me guilty? Poirot handed her a neatly folded handkerchief. Only in your soul, mademoiselle, not in law. She pressed it to her eyes, but the tears would not stop. He rose and gestured gently toward the door. You will sleep tonight, yes? You must try. She nodded, dazed, and walked slowly out of the room, leaving the handkerchief behind. I moved to retrieve it, but Poirot stayed my hand. Leave it, Hastings, he said softly. It is not evidence, it is burden. When the door closed behind her, I turned to Poirot in disbelief. But surely, I said, if she confessed. Non, mon ami, he interrupted, his voice unusually grave. It was a confession of longing, not of fact. But she knew details, details easily guessed. A poison in a drink, it is almost too neat, too literary. But the true criminal, Hastings, rarely thinks in such narrative flourishes. I sat down, watching him pace. She wanted Morell dead, yes, but she did not kill him. Her story was too elegant, too perfectly tragic. He looked up, eyes gleaming, and most importantly, it did not fit. The music faltered, but not in the way she claimed. The moment of collapse was not that of poison, but of timing. He stopped by the window. "No, Hastings, the truth is yet to come, and when it does, it will not weep, it will stare." It was just past noon, and Poirot, having paced the drawing-room in precise lines for the better part of an hour, rang for Lady Eleanor. She arrived with her usual composure, silk rustling faintly, face as unreadable as a porcelain mask. "My dear Lady Eleanor," he began, all courtly charm, "you will forgive the intrusion, but I find myself at an impasse most peculiar. There is, you see, some minor confusion regarding the dates of birth for your guests. Purely genealogical, of course." She blinked, just once. "The family Bible," he continued. "So many of the English houses keep one. Might I consult it?" After the briefest hesitation, she inclined her head. "Certainly, Mem Poirot. It is kept in the glass cabinet by the north fireplace." She did not offer to retrieve it herself. Poirot fetched the volume with great care, brushing away a thread of dust from its binding. I saw at once the glint in his eye, the gleam that meant something had already begun to unravel in his mind. We sat together on the divan, as he leafed through the pages with reverence. Each yellowed leaf bore the careful ink of generations, baptisms, marriages, deaths. It was in essence a history of bloodlines, and Poirot treated it as such. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured, stopping at a page titled 1895, 1905. "These entries here, neat, yes, all the same hand, ink faded uniformly." And there his finger landed on a name, Celeste Marie Talbot. The ink was darker. The handwriting, though deliberately similar, bore the telltale signs of modernity, rounder loops, a less rigid slope. "This," he whispered, "is no original entry." I frowned. "It's been added, may we, recently, to suggest that she belongs." He turned the page almost reverently. "But nature, Hastings, nature is stubborn. It leaves its traces, and one cannot erase what was once concealed by silence." He closed the Bible slowly. "We must speak to the girl." The room was bathed in lavender gloom when we found her. Celeste, curled into the piano bench, fingers resting like fallen leaves on ivory keys. She did not play. She simply sat there, as though the memory of music still clung to her skin. Poirot approached softly, his voice gentler than usual. "Mademoiselle, may I sit beside you?" She nodded, not looking up. He waited a long moment before he spoke again. "You are fond of this room, n'est-ce pas?" Her lips quivered into a faint smile. "It's quiet here. Music," Poirot said, "reveals things words often conceal. But today I will ask you to try with words." She stiffened. "You came to England when?" She blinked. "I was 12. After my governess was dismissed. In Vienna." A nod. "And before that, your parents?" "My mother died when I was very young. My father," she paused. "He was a pianist." Poirot said nothing, only looked at her, not accusingly, but as if waiting for her to hear her own truth aloud. "I came here after a scandal," she added, so softly I almost missed it. "Lady Eleanor said it was better that way." "For whom?" Poirot asked gently. Celeste had no answer. She stared down at her hands, and when she spoke again, her voice was a whisper lost among shadows. "I remember the scent of cigars, the red velvet drapes. My governess said we were to pretend we were guests in that house, not residents." Poirot nodded slowly. "Was your father kind?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then hesitated. "Sometimes. Did you know his name?" She shook her head. "Not then. He was never called father, only monsieur." Poirot folded his hands. "And what changed?" She looked at him then, really looked. "The letters, the ones my governess burned. but I saw the names, Arthur Morel and Eleanor Talbot. A tear slipped down her cheek. I wasn't supposed to know, but when they sent me here, to England, Lady Eleanor said I was her niece, that I must forget Vienna, that the past was not polite. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. But the past, mademoiselle, it does not forget us. She sobbed once softly. He never spoke to me, not once since I arrived, but he knew. Yes, Poirot said, and yet he did not act. That is a cruelty too refined for accident. The silence that followed was not peaceful. We returned to the main hall, where Poirot requested a word with Lady Eleanor. She appeared almost at once, too quickly I thought, and met us with her usual grace. Madame, Poirot said, there is something missing from the study, a photograph. She raised an eyebrow. You surprise me, Poirot. Do I? He said softly. It was once placed upon the desk with affection. Now it has been hidden. He stepped past her, opened a lacquered drawer in the writing bureau, and withdrew a thin envelope. Forgive the liberty, he said, but the scent of bergamot clung to the drawer's edge, the same as your gloves. Inside was a black and white photograph. Arthur Morel, younger, arms draped around a pale woman, and a small girl. A Vienna cafe in the background. The child's eyes unmistakable. Celeste. Poirot held it lightly, as one might a broken locket. Lady Eleanor did not faint, nor gasp. Instead she drew herself up straighter. You cannot know what it was like, she said. Poirot's voice was barely a murmur. Then tell me. She inhaled sharply. Arthur was careless, charming but foolish. Vienna was a disaster. The girl's mother, she died, and Celeste had no one. You claimed her as your niece. I brought her here, she said simply. Changed her name. It was the only way to save her. And to save the Talbot name, why not adopt her fully? Because people talk, and because in Poirot, I had no wish to raise a pianist's child as my heir. Poirot gave a slight bow. Yet you let her stay under your roof. Why? Lady Eleanor's face cracked just slightly. Because she plays beautifully, and I am not without sentiment. But perhaps, Poirot said gently, you are not without guilt either. Lady Eleanor said nothing. Poirot laid the photograph flat upon the walnut writing table in the library, smoothing its curled edge with the tender care one might offer a wounded thing. The image stared back at us. Arthur Morel and Lady Eleanor Talbot, side by side before the grand colonnade of the Vienna Opera House. Though dressed in evening finery, and framed by the elegance of marble steps and horse-drawn carriages, the intimacy of their posture betrayed more than friendship. His arm rested lightly around her waist. Her gloved hand clutched his with quiet insistence. Mais oui, Poirot said softly. There is affection here. No more than that. There is ownership. A claim made and one never entirely withdrawn. I glanced at him. You believe they were lovers. I do not believe these things. I see. The eyes, the angle of the shoulders, the care with which she allowed herself to be captured in his presence, and then buried it from view. He turned the photograph slightly toward the dying firelight. It was not meant to be remembered, but it refused to be forgotten. Lady Eleanor did not speak when shown the photograph. She gazed upon it in silence, her face drawn but not collapsed, as though seeing an echo of a version of herself she had long buried in layers of inherited duty and social veneer. Poirot gave her time. You see, he said gently, the romance was never truly concealed, only placed behind a pane of glass, and called a relic. It was a mistake, she murmured. Non, madame. It was a choice, and one whose consequences have grown fat in the darkness. She flinched, then recovered. I was young, 28, Poirot corrected quietly. Not so young that you did not understand the stakes, And he,
Arthur Morel,
he gave you a child. Her eyes lifted to meet his then, and for a moment something flickered there. Not denial, but grief. And you left Vienna,
he added,
not for decorum, but because love had become a burden you could not carry in daylight. Still she said nothing, but her silence had ceased to be dismissive. It had become confession. That afternoon, Poirot and I drove down to the solicitor's office in the village of Chisley-on-Grey. The building was modest, its brickwork damp from the mist and ivy curling like old fingers around its windows. Mr. Everley, the Talbots' legal representative for over 3 decades, was a fussy man with ink-stained cuffs and a voice that trembled with either deference or age. Poirot, ever courteous, made his request plainly. You understand, monsieur, this concerns not only the dead but the legacy he wished to leave behind. Mr. Everley produced a ledger, thick with vellum and annotated with generations of amendments. He tapped a slender page near the end. Here, he said, adjusting his spectacles, dated last Tuesday, Arthur Morel made an emergency revision to his will. Entire estate, including his portion of Greystone and all royalties from his musical compositions, were to pass to Celeste Marie Talbot, referred to in the codicil as his daughter. I stared. That's unusual, Everley offered. Unprecedented, more like. And the previous beneficiary? Poirot asked. Lady Eleanor. Poirot nodded once. It is always money, Hastings, but never just money. He asked for the date and hour the will was signed. Everley consulted a note. 3 p.m., the day before the performance. As we stepped outside, the mist having thickened around us like a forgotten veil, Poirot held his umbrella beneath his arm, and spoke in a voice low and reflective. Consider, Hastings. The will is amended at 3 o'clock on Tuesday. Arthur is dead not 26 hours later. You think someone learned of it? Poirot's eyes narrowed. Think? None. I know. He paused at the carriage step. The staff gossip. Solicitors have secretaries. News trickles like water beneath a cellar door. And if Lady Eleanor— he interrupted, raising a finger. You assume she is the only one with something to lose. But so many in that house live within illusion. Claudia, Lionel, even young Celeste. Each must guard a fiction, lest their place in the music of Greystone fall out of tune. He climbed into the carriage, the lines of his face unusually still. And when fiction is threatened by fact, he said, the result is often murder. We found her in the morning room, alone. The fire had not been lit, and her shawl lay discarded on the floor. A detail that, with Lady Eleanor, spoke of deeper disarray. She did not ask why we had come. I feared it, she said, before Poirot could utter a word. From the moment Arthur wrote to me from Vienna, Poirot remained silent. He threatened to expose it, not out of spite, but from some twisted sense of justice. He said it was time Celeste was given her due, that the past must no longer be buried in lace and silence. You refused? I pleaded. I reminded him what it would mean. The scandal, the papers, the musicians who would gossip at the academy. My family's name, Im Poirot, my father's name. Poirot's voice was soft. And Celeste? She would be ruined, Eleanor said. A foundling paraded through London society as a daughter of shame. That's what they would have called her. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And yet it was the truth. She closed her eyes, but the truth is not always a kindness. No, Poirot agreed, but murder is never a mercy. Her face crumpled like old paper. Later, in the quiet of the East Gallery, Poirot stood looking out toward the frozen fields beyond the ha-ha. I remained beside him, silent, until he spoke. It was never about inheritance, he said at last. Not truly. The money, yes, it stings, but the real wound, mon amour, was to the illusion. He turned, his face unusually grave. Arthur Morell intended to speak after the performance, to announce to the gathered guests that Celeste was his daughter, and that he had named her heir. But why then? Because he was dying, Poirot said simply. The heart attack was real, but not the first. He had been warned. He glanced back toward the house. Lady Eleanor lived not for vanity, but for image, and to protect that image, she was capable of sacrifice. I felt a chill pass through me, and someone, Poirot added quietly, believed that sacrifice should extend to Arthur. He tapped the window pane. And so, Hastings, the final act begins. Supper at Greystone passed in a peculiar hush, a civility too carefully upheld to be natural. The soup was untouched by some, devoured too quickly by others. Conversation made a brave attempt, faltering mid-flight, like a bird unnerved by thunder. When the last course was cleared, Poirot stood, impeccable as ever, though his eyes had lost none of their brightness. "If you please," he said, gently tapping a spoon against the rim of his water-glass, "I would ask that all of you join me in the drawing-room. There is something of importance, I must say." There was no mistaking the solemnity in his tone. It was not a request, it was the final toll of a distant bell, inevitable and grave. Lady Eleanor looked up sharply, her mouth poised around a retort she never uttered. Celeste paled. Claudia Brent raised her brows in theatrical boredom, but her fingers gripped the edge of the tablecloth just a little too tightly. We rose, chairs scraping softly like whispers, and so, with measured tread, we walked into the last act of a tragedy long rehearsed beneath the polished floors of Greystone. The drawing-room had been prepared, though by whom I did not know. The curtains were drawn tight against the dusk. Only candles illuminated the space, their flickering light rendering every corner uncertain and every gesture shadowed twice over. The fireplace was unlit, and a silence hovered in the air as though something sacred or terrible was about to be unearthed. We sat, Claudia draped herself on the ottoman, her eyes glinting like broken glass. Lionel Markham remained erect, spine like a metronome, ticking with control. Richard Vale leaned forward, his hands clenched, the skin around his knuckles taut. Celeste sat quietly in a high-backed chair, her gaze trained not on Poirot, but on her own lap. Lady Eleanor took her place last, moving with the deliberation of a queen entering a trial of state. Poirot, standing before the hearth, as if it were a judge's bench, folded his hands. "Mercy," he said. "You have been patient. Now I ask you for your attention, for truth has waited long enough in this house." Poirot began with no preamble, no dramatics, no pause for effect. His voice was clear, exact, and chillingly devoid of emotion. Arthur Morell was poisoned. Gasps audible and immediate punctuated the air. No, not by accident, not by some tragic ailment of the heart. He was administered a dose of cyanide, a clever amount, in a cleverly disguised drink. He held up a small folded cloth. I found the residue in the base of the pianist's glass, faint but unmistakable. Claudia whispered, "Cyanide, oui, mademoiselle, bitter almonds, but masked by honey and the herb liqueur served before the performance." Poirot began to pace, slowly, as though stepping to the rhythm of a forgotten melody. You see, Arthur Morell had his drink placed on a tray by the staff, but minutes before he played, he requested a fresh glass. His gaze swept across the room, and that was the fatal moment. The poison had been added to the first, not the second. There was a pause, like the held breath before an orchestra resumes, which means, he continued softly, that the murderer did not, could not, account for the switch. He turned his head slightly. That moment, mes amis, was not part of the plan, and it is this unplanned detail that revealed the truth. For only one person showed alarm at the switch, though they concealed it well. Only one person had both motive and opportunity. He stepped forward, and it was not Claudia Brent. Poirot reached into his pocket and withdrew the now familiar photograph, the faded image of Arthur Morel and Lady Eleanor, arm in arm outside the Vienna Opera House. He placed it gently on the side table, angled toward the guests. This was not merely a keepsake, he said. It was a warning. Lady Eleanor's eyes did not move. For years it lay hidden, but recently it was removed from its frame, a silent act of desperation. One does not discard such a relic unless it threatens something far greater than memory. He pointed to the child in the background, barely visible but present. This image proved what words could still be denied, that Arthur Morel was not simply a friend of the Talbot family, but its architect in more ways than one. Poirot turned slightly. The photograph was taken in Vienna, so was Celeste. There was a terrible quiet. The photograph is not a trinket, it is a truth laid bare in silver salts, and to Lady Eleanor it was a death sentence. His voice lowered, and so to avoid disgrace, she chose to silence the man who held the match to her paper-thin world. Poirot's voice softened, but not with pity. She did not hate him. No, Lady Eleanor admired Arthur Morel once, perhaps even loved him, in the careful, conditional way society allows women of her station to love. He faced her now, but admiration curdles when it threatens your foundation, and pride, madame, is the most dangerous drug in all of England's drawing rooms. She said nothing. Celeste's birth was an embarrassment. Her presence at Greystone, a careful rewriting of the past. Lady Eleanor gave her shelter, schooling, even a surname, but never her truth. He turned to us, then, and when Arthur Morel returned, with his heart failing, his will changed, and his tongue finally ready to speak, Lady Eleanor panicked. The music room, the evening performance, the assembled guests, it was all arranged not as celebration, but as confrontation. Poirot's tone grew firmer. She laced the first drink, not with rage but resolve. When he asked for a fresh one, she prayed it would not be delivered. But fate, as it often does, preferred irony. He paused. She did not act to kill the man, she acted to kill the truth. He looked again at Lady Eleanor, and in doing so, ensured it would rise louder than any sonata. Lady Eleanor stood. The room did not breathe. She walked toward Poirot slowly, almost dreamlike. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable, yet her hands trembled at her sides, barely contained within the lace of her sleeves. She looked at the photograph, not with grief, nor nostalgia, but with a strange kind of relief. Then she turned to Poirot, her eyes dark as ink. "I had nothing left but appearances," she said. Her voice was quiet, level, and final. "I built a house out of manners and tradition, a name out of ashes. I carried the Talbot legacy on my back while others played at freedom." Poirot bowed his head slightly. "No one asked me what it cost," she added. "Not once." She did not weep. She did not beg. Celeste rose as if to speak, but Poirot gently raised a hand. "None," he said softly. Lady Eleanor stepped back. "Will you summon the police?" "No," Poirot replied. "I will summon the truth. What the law does, that is for England to decide." She gave a small sad smile, and sat down, like a queen at the close of her reign. The first grey ribbons of morning had only just begun to creep over the lawn when the sound of a motor car announced the arrival of Inspector Grange. He stepped out stiffly, still fastening the final button of his greatcoat, his breath visible in the chill. A man unaccustomed to poetry, Grange bore the solemnity of his office with plain efficiency, a contrast to the baroque melancholy that still hung about Greystone Manor like a closing curtain. Lady Eleanor was already dressed and waiting in the library, seated beneath the ancestral portrait of some proud ancestor, whose gaze, I thought absurdly, seemed to waver. She rose without assistance as the inspector entered. Her gloves were clasped neatly in one hand, and her voice, when she spoke, held neither defiance nor apology. "I am ready." Grange gave a curt nod, offering his arm. She declined it with a small shake of her head. There were no tears, no protestations, no final speeches. Only a silence so composed that it chilled me more than any outburst could have. As they passed through the front hall, I followed behind them, instinct guiding me more than intent. And then, at the music-room door, she paused. For a brief moment, Lady Eleanor remained utterly still. Her eyes, now dulled by something that went far deeper than fatigue, fixed themselves upon the grand piano. The lid had been closed the previous evening. A fresh sheet of music sat untouched upon the stand. Liszt, if my memory served, something solemn, something unresolved. She did not move closer. She did not speak. But her glance was long enough to constitute a kind of farewell, not merely to the room or to the music, but to the version of herself that had once inhabited it. Poirot, standing a few paces behind, observed her closely. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers twitched ever so slightly, as though restraining a gesture, of pity perhaps, or restraint. Then Lady Eleanor turned again, and with a final lift of her chin, allowed herself to be escorted out into the morning light. There is something quite humbling, even pitiable, about the way people leave a house after a tragedy. No one speaks of it, but the cadence is unmistakable, slower footsteps, eyes avoiding familiar portraits, polite murmurs dulled by shame. By 9 o'clock, the guests had begun to depart. Claudia Brent, resplendent even in resignation, descended the staircase with her violin case clutched like a weapon of war. She offered Poirot a nod so slight, it barely existed. Lionel Markham departed next, his valise fastidiously packed. He muttered something about the Paris Conservatoire and appointments he must now decline, but I noticed the deepening creases beside his mouth, not sorrow, exactly, but something akin to the wear of calculation. Richard Vale and Celeste left last. He supported her arm, though she did not seem in need of it. Celeste turned once on the front steps, gazing back at the house with an unreadable expression, not grief, but recognition. A chapter closed, however, unwillingly. Poirot stood near the fireplace, unmoved, his eyes following each guest as one might study chess pieces returning to their boxes. "Regret, mon ami," he said quietly, "is a very British burden. They carry it well, and never lay it down." As we walked back through the eastern corridor, my attention was drawn to the narrow mirror that hung beside the grandfather clock, a tall, elegant glass framed in ornate brass. I had passed it a dozen times, but now I noticed something strange. A crack, fine as a hairline, splitting the glass from corner to corner. It hadn't been there before, or had it? Poirot stopped beside it, and for a moment simply looked at his own reflection. Then he turned his head to me, his voice low and meditative. "You see, Hastings, the mirror, it lies to us even when it is whole. It shows only the surface. But when it breaks, then the lie is fractured, and we are forced to confront what lies beyond the symmetry." I gave a non-committal grunt, uncertain what he meant. The illusions here were very fine, polished, maintained, admired. But even the most exquisite illusion, once cracked, reveals the scaffolding beneath. He touched the edge of the frame with a fingertip, and when pride is the glue that holds the illusion, mon Dieu, the break is always inevitable. He turned then, and the broken reflection vanished behind him. Later that morning we took our breakfast in the sunlit conservatory, a quiet affair of eggs, toast and marmalade that Poirot dissected with surgical precision. For a time we ate in silence. Then, as he poured himself a second cup of tea, he spoke. "Tell me, Hastings, do you believe justice was served?" I paused. She confessed. "The police have taken her." "Isn't that justice?" "Ah, but the law, my friend, is not always justice. And justice is not always moral clarity." Lady Eleanor protected her name at the cost of another man's life. She did not act from hatred, but from fear. I nodded, unsure. Poirot continued, "One must never confuse reputation with righteousness, nor mistake beauty for virtue. That, mon cher, is where most crimes begin." He folded his napkin neatly. "And yet, even after all this, there is something in her that I cannot quite condemn." His eyes wandered toward the garden. She loved appearances. But perhaps appearances were all she was ever allowed to love. We were nearly ready to depart when I wandered once more into the drawing room. The chairs had been rearranged, the candles extinguished, the music stands were gone, and the polished floor gleamed coldly beneath the morning light. But it was the silence that struck me, thick, lingering, as though something unsaid still floated in the air. Poirot joined me a moment later, his hat in hand. "The music is gone," I said. "Mais non, Hastings," he replied. "The music remains. It is only the harmony that has vanished." I looked at him, puzzled. "The harmony of pretense," he clarified softly, "and in its absence, what remains is truth, harsh, unmelodic, but clear." We stood there another minute, as if expecting someone to strike a chord, to resume the performance. But the room offered only silence, and sometimes I thought, that is the loudest sound of all. Even in places adorned with music and elegance, the human heart can compose its darkest symphonies. Some secrets are buried not out of shame, but out of love distorted by time and pride. Do you believe the preservation of legacy is ever worth the price of a life? If this mystery moved you, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales where silence holds the loudest truths.